Welcome to the Business Show. My name is Finn Murphy. I'm a principal at Frontline Ventures, and thanks for joining us today. The topic of the discussion is bullish on the Irish venture capital investment, the Innovation Nation. Make sure to join the conversation online on Twitter or Facebook at the Business Show IRL, and make sure to use the hashtag Rebooting Ireland. So just to give you a little bit of context on the panel, so last year in 2020, there was $970 million to a survey about, even though the year had started pretty on a down buzz, and all of us sitting in our houses, everyone seemed to be much more bullish on the Irish venture ecosystem and the startup ecosystem as a whole. So the kind of top purpose of the panel is to get some views from luminaries within that venture community and see what's happened in the past, what's happening in the future, and what everyone's opinions are on why that bullishness is there. So joining me on the panel today, we have Alan Foy, the chairman of VentureWave. We have Nicola McClafferty, the partner at Draper Esprit, and we've Claire McHugh, the CEO and co-founder of Axonista and a steering group member at Scale Ireland. So thanks everyone for joining us on the panel today. To start off, the first question, bullish on the Irish venture ecosystem. Why do we think people are so bullish on the Irish venture ecosystem today? Alan, I'm going to pick on you first.
Sure, no problem, Finn. I think there's a couple of factors. I think it's kind of push and pull. I think in large part, obviously, the great thing is there's a lot of liquidity in the system, as you mentioned earlier. I think in an Irish context, we haven't had as vibrant a funding market for great opportunities. But I think on the other side of that equation, we're also very fortunate in that the pipeline of companies, the quality of companies, the quality of founders, and the readiness, if you like, of product market fit and scalability on a global perspective has never been better in an Irish context, I'd say. And, I would say quite honestly that Ireland is becoming a hotbed for talent. Like, I think talented teams that are not just natively Irish, but actually international want to locate here as well. So I think there's a whole kind of myriad of factors. I think it's the first time probably where we've actually seen good alignment of both supply and demand. There are certainly certain areas within the tech scene in general that aren't getting funded, and we can talk about that later. But I think in large part, it's better than it's ever been, and it's certainly very well positioned for growth, I'd say.
Yeah, I guess I would just echo kind of a little bit of what Alan said. I totally agree. Ireland has always sort of punched above its weight as a market in terms of ability to produce interesting kind of technology companies and research or innovation-led businesses. And so, we've been present here for the last decade or so, investing in high-tech startups. But actually, the confluence of exactly what Alan talked about, the infrastructure now that's there and being put around these companies by way of capital, by way of supports, by way of sort of talent, is sort of better now than it's ever been. And I think, so we've got to be sort of really optimistic about the ability to create not just sort of a much stronger wave of more interesting tech and innovation-led businesses, but actually to really scale those businesses beyond what we've seen thus far in the Irish market.
Just to add to all that, I agree with everything Alan and Nicola have said, but, and Alan sort of alluded to this a little bit, that there are, while it's overall there's a positive picture, early stage companies are struggling, and also female-founded companies are not raising as much as you would hope that they are. And I have to represent both of those, the founder perspective here. Deals under 5 million, I think fell by about a third last year. And also, while Irish female founders raised over 100 million, which is a record amount, it's just 10% of the total funding that's raised last year. And that isn't good enough, and we really need to look at that too.
No, it's interesting you like bringing up those points, Claire, because it does feel that occasionally the venture ecosystem is kind of a world of like haves and have-nots. It's either the funding gets done in a week and there's 10 term sheets, or the companies struggle to raise. And like particularly within the Irish ecosystem, what do we think of the types of business, there's obviously the male-female founder split, but then what else is going? Is it a market thing? Is it an investor interest thing? What do we think is creating that divide, especially within the Irish, or is it an access to capital and access to networks? What is actually causing that divide, or do we have any ideas?
I could give a perspective, if that's all right. I suppose ultimately, Finn, I think there's a couple of kind of issues. One is while there is more capital, that capital really wants to put more of that capital to work, if that makes sense. So there's kind of minimum check sizes. So a lot of the international VCs, for example, that are more active in the Irish market now, they are used to writing much larger dollar value amounts in their series rounds. And therefore, the capacity of the company to take that equity, absorb it, means that the company has to be of a certain size in general. So that's definitely an issue, I think. And certainly it seems that while there's capital available for really early stage, almost project seed type funding, as in kind of small dollar amounts, or euro amounts like 20, 30,000 euro and so on, really seed stuff. There does seem to be, as Claire pointed out, a gap in that early stage, between that and really what's a full round Series A. And I think that's where there's a real gap. And I think it's a valley. It's been called different things in the venture world, but there is a valley, there is a gulf there at the moment. And I think, unfortunately, the ecosystem right now isn't aligned. And where that typically has been funded, I would say historically, well, not just in Ireland, but internationally, is through friends and family and angel rounds. And I would say while angels are more active in general, they're not as interested in that category of company. And I think that's an issue. I don't know if the panel agree, but I think that's where the issue lies.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Seed is the gap in Ireland. And, a few years ago, it was growth capital, but actually now, the barriers are dropped. Growth stage funding or Series A is a global business. Seed is a local business. And what we've seen across Europe, in markets like Berlin and Paris and Stockholm and sort of other capitals, they've managed to develop an incredibly vibrant early stage ecosystem matched with really strong local funding, and that's kind of strong local fund managers, but also dedicated local seed funds. And I think as a market, given the sort of size of our tech market, we've probably been underserved with meaningful local seed capital. And that's the big challenge, because while any Irish business, will be able to raise kind of later stage funding from any VC internationally, seed remains a really local business. And I think unless we sort of fix this, and when we talk about seed, by the way, we're talking about, anything up to that first 5 million of funding. It really isn't just the very, very early stage, kind of friends and family and almost pre-seed rounds. What we've seen with the just sheer availability of capital is there's more capital being looked to put to work, but round sizes themselves are increasing. The average Series A, we invest kind of from Series A kind of through to Series C is sort of where we typically invest. But the average A round that we're seeing at a European level is $10 million. That's kind of 2x where the average A round, used to sit a few years ago. So arguably these labels are becoming increasingly meaningless. But what's driving those round sizes is greater availability of capital in local markets supporting larger seed rounds. And you're seeing that across Europe in local hubs. So you're building local winners really quickly that can then access that sort of international capital. And I think it's just the one area where we're falling behind a little bit in Ireland, and we just need to be really mindful of filling that gap and the role that kind of more local funds and whether the state needs to play a more meaningful role about sort of larger scale funds at that seed stage to make sure that gulf doesn't widen further.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think from what I'm hearing from founders who are first-time founders and didn't have the opportunity to make relationships before the pandemic, it's really difficult to do that now. Like, while you can keep relationships up if you've already developed them, to actually start them and know where to go and who to talk to is very different. So I think there's a little bit of that too.
Nicola, it was interesting. You kind of mentioned a bunch of European cities like Stockholm, Berlin, Paris. Oftentimes people bring up the tax efficient layer of funding in the UK as the missing piece in Ireland, and I know Draper, you have VCT funds and are like kind of connected to that ecosystem deeply. And I think a lot of people bring this up as the magic solution, like that's the bullet that Ireland needs to solve our funding woes. And I'd be curious to know the panel's thoughts across that, because is it in the UK, if Stockholm and Berlin can do it through local fund means, is that something that can be replicated in Ireland, or should we lean more into the UK direction and try to tap into that tax efficient funding layer?
I think there's multiple. I mean, look, the short answer in my view is there's no one silver bullet. And I think if you try to look for that silver bullet, we'll all be looking for a long time. But there are certainly kind of a handful of measures that can be taken that would sort of better support. And it's everything from, you know, being able to access more tax efficient capital, and how do we better tap into high net worth capital, or that capital that's looking for a home. Historically, that capital has gone to the property market. We need to sort of reallocate that capital back into the tech market. But right now, there aren't really that many incentives that would align that, you know, unless it's a founder, and we're really benefiting from this generation of second time round founders, those that have made money. You know, they are putting capital back into the tech ecosystem, but that's not enough, right? They're doing it because they know the business, they understand the business, they've been in their shoes, and you know, and that's helpful. That's a big part of building a vibrant ecosystem, because those angels bring not just capital, but expertise and networks. But actually, you need to broaden that base. You need to broaden, whether that's filtered through funds or just enabling direct investment. And I know that, you know, Claire might be able to speak more to this in terms of what Scale Ireland are doing. But, you know, releasing that capital and putting tax incentives in place that would open up access to that kind of private high net worth capital into early stage innovation led companies is a really meaningful lever. It's not the only lever, but it's a strong lever. And we certainly saw the opening of EIS, I should say, and VCT in the UK was a real driver of early stage capital in that market. And the other thing is around just the other tax point, not to labor the tax points home, is an employment infrastructure and an employee incentive structure that will better support being able to incentivize and attract talent here. And you know, and tax is the lever we have to play with. Like I said, it's not the only answer here, but we've got to fix that. And that's what other countries have done incredibly well. It's released capital, it's made the hub an attractive place to come either start a business or join a startup company. And we really need to put that infrastructure in place to continue to allow sort of the really early stage ecosystem to thrive here.
Yeah, I'd echo that point, actually. I think it's funny, you know, I used to be involved in a business called Blueface, which, you know, when we were raising capital historically, we were competing with property projects for high net worth individuals, really. And we had the equivalent of really what was EIS, or the EIS at the time. So I think you're right. I think there's definitely a high net worth group opportunity there for that ecosystem in Ireland. I think there's a combination of, I think the VCT structure is a good one, but I think there's a combination of the tax structure, making these kind of companies productizable, quite frankly, for the high net worth audience. And that might be like a, you know, a kind of crowdfunding plus type model. But also the role of, you know, of the state here. So we talk about Enterprise Ireland being this great funder, and it is, and we kind of need EI to see those cohort groups as a professional investor and make sure that the matchmaking framework and so on is an easy one to onboard these companies. And then, of course, the other part of the equation as well is once you have all those kind of fabrics in place, is making sure that if there is a tax element to it, that the tax authorization process, if you like, for the investor and the investee company is as seamless as it possibly can be. Certainly I've heard a lot of kind of stories recently of just how difficult it actually is in practice. So I think it's all those kind of pieces that Nicola's kind of touched on. But I do think that there's a willingness in that high net worth audience, both from entrepreneurs who are tech entrepreneurs who've done well, but also just more broadly, you know, corporates and executives and professionals and others who are in that high net worth category who really want to be involved in these kind of direct companies. And it's just making sure that we got the framework in place to make it easy for them to do so.
And it's not just direct investment either. I mean, to your point about productizing it, actually we need new fund managers coming in, right? We need to kind of think about fund structures here where, you know, high net worth shouldn't necessarily be the one to have to kind of individually look at every single deal. You're absolutely right. So what can we do to unlock incentives to actually invest in funds that are sort of seed focused, innovation focused, potentially additionally supported by the state, and then bringing in kind of a new generation of fund managers who can really manage that. And I think that's actually something that'll be, you know, could be incredibly powerful.
As well as that, I think it's amazing to actually, for the first time, have something like Scale Ireland in existence to actually advocate for the Indigenous Irish tech sector, because, you know, that didn't happen before. And because of that, you had lots of ideas, but nothing unified. And it's really great to be able to kind of bring those different parties together to advocate for that sector and, you know, make recommendations on improvements to EIAS and other schemes like that, and capital gains tax and keep schemes and all of the different things that are there that are levers at the very highest level of government. So it's wonderful to actually have Scale Ireland.
No, yeah, no, it's. I think it's to your point, Scale Ireland. You mentioned there even the Keep scheme, and Nicola, you kind of alluded to it as well around incentive structures for employees. Like I think we've talked a little, like a good bit about the fundraising environment, but you know, I think a lot of the time investors complain. They say, you know, talent is the rate limiting factor. Like there's infinite money in the world, but where are the people to deploy it to? How do we think Ireland compares to, say, you know, again, like the UK in terms of, I think we've talked about it a little bit, it's changing because there's a new generation of companies with people with more skill sets, but are we like, are we at the point where Ireland's talent are ready to build scale-ups here without having to move to the US? Or do things still have to change and incentive schemes to be put in place to make that change happen and allow, you know, these huge companies to be built in Ireland without having to move executives abroad?
So I think it's a lot better than it used to be. I mean, the kind of question is, do you have to leave the country now to build a global scale, company? And, you know, I think the answer a few years ago might have been, yeah, maybe you should. And certainly now it's not. Now, that's not to say the incentive structures are where they should be, but there's just enough other kind of supports in the ecosystem that if you're an Irish founder, you know, for the most part, a lot of Irish founders I took want to stay in Ireland to do this, right? So are we in a place where we could feasibly attract founders into Ireland to set up a business? I mean, that's harder when you're attracting sort of external talent. But this is where, you know, I think we shouldn't sort of undersell Ireland as a place to kind of scale a company now. What wasn't as possible to do even 5 years ago is far more feasible now in terms of being able to build a company. And partly that's just an attitude change as well. It's not just the infrastructure change. I mean, there's been kind of meaningful success stories. Founders' ambitions have changed. And I kind of really feel that from even when I first came back to the Irish market. I was out of this market for a long time. I came back kind of investing here kind of 4 years ago. Even in that time, it feels like there's been a sort of a step change in ambition, in a sense that, of course, I can attract capital and the best talent, and that expectation has risen. And that's really great to see. I think we've got a lot of superb talent, particularly on the technical side in the Irish market. I think the market is a little bit lacking in sort of commercial sales and marketing in terms of really sort of scaling up technology businesses. But again, we're getting better there. So all of this sort of takes time to put in place. But like I said, just because you're building and scaling a company out of Ireland, that doesn't mean every employee has to be in Ireland either. So I think everything is in place to build really more unicorns as we go out of the Irish market, better than it ever has been.
Just to add on that, like, I think there's something there around what Nicola just said about scaling from Ireland and building a company that doesn't have to have all its team in Ireland. Europe really has to do a better job on a better joined up thinking around things like ESOPs and share option schemes, where, you know, you can actually set it up for success. And as a founder, you're not spending all your time trying to figure out how to reward your employees in different countries. So I think there's a lot of work still there to do to put us in a position where we can be as competitive as US companies.
Yeah, I think there's been a seismic shift, I mean, obviously over the last year, obviously for obvious reasons with COVID, but to kind of global mobility of talent in general, and where, you know, teams are physically based, where individuals are physically based. I think there's a more kind of open-minded nature to that. I would say, you know, I've spent the kind of last number of years in the States, and I think historically, a lot of Irish entrepreneurs went to the States for capital. So I think now that the capital problem has been solved largely here in the Irish market, that will actually draw people to stay, I would say, on home shore. And I think the opportunity to create global businesses out of Ireland, given the talent mix, given the ecosystem, given quite frankly, our good bilateral relations with most nations around the world, is really positive. And it's something that we shouldn't undersell. you know, I've had the fortunate opportunity to bring really two US companies to Ireland, but I've been two sales processes. And one of the kind of key hallmarks of what they say is just how amazing the talent is in Ireland. But the interesting thing about that talent is it's often not all Irish. It's actually international by its nature with Irish, and they are happy to exist in this ecosystem. So I think we have a lot going for us. And to the point of building unicorns, the barriers just aren't there. Okay, there is this issue, as we all know, around, you know, taxation and share options, and there's a lot of work to do there. That will get solved. I hope and believe it will get solved. But that's really, you know, the kind of the one last remaining outstanding item, I would say, from a talent pool perspective. Given the mobility and given just the sheer confidence we have in the system now as well, we've actually got, I mean, the biggest thing in the States, and you guys have all spent time in the States as well, in the US, you've got really good ambassadors who have shown how they can build and scale businesses. And they feed back into the system, not just through their capital, but through their insight, their connections, and so on. And it's that virtuous circle. And that's starting to happen more and more now here in Ireland. And I just think it's like a snowball. It'll get bigger and bigger as time goes on. So I'll be pretty bullish.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting point around the changes layering over time. I don't know if you saw David McWilliams had a piece around Ireland having too many lawyers and accountants. And I think it's like, you know, if you can't be what you can't see and you can't aspire to. And I think there's a lot going on around, you know, university accelerator programs, the Collison brothers, exactly to everyone's point that if you're young and you see the new immersive software engineering course in UL, are you going to want to go do law in Trinity, or are you going to want to go and become the next Patrick Collison? It really, I think it does speak a lot to the talent. It'd be interesting, just on something you said, that, you know, as we shift to a more remote and distributed world where talent is, I think talent is going to centralize and talent's going to move. But will the definition of an Irish company change? You know, FDI was always very focused on the business park. You know, we're going to get 16,000 people in a big warehouse working together. Will those, like, what is an Irish company, a company that's founded in Ireland that might have people all around the world, will that change the way we think about how we incentivize companies, how we think about what Irishness is, or is that just the new way of the world? Will that just be the new way of the world?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think ultimately, you know, the nature of how we define what is global Irish, I think, is going to change and has changed in large part. I think you're right. I mean, the model has transformed from this kind of, what would you call it, I suppose, employment subsidy, kind of industrial park methodology to one of, well, if you want a creative, innovative, kind of strong commercial place to do business, Ireland is the place to do it. And I think that nature of our relationship with our global peers, if you like, in terms of if it's multinationals, if it's other counterparts, being kind of at the center, on the fulcrum of, well, we're a good, easy place to do business. And we've got this creative talent and capacity to be boundaryless in terms of our business propositions. That's got to be part of what we define as Irishness, if that makes sense. So we always talk about the 80 million that claim Irish diaspora kind of connectivity. Well, maybe we can turn that, you know, 80 into 180 or a billion by virtue of our connectivity through business. So I think it's a change in the narrative, but I don't think it's a change of the nature of what it means to be Irish in terms of the storytelling, the boundaryless behavior. You know, that we're on a tiny island, but we're global in our thinking. I think all of that has to feed into the IDA strategy, into the state strategy, and ultimately into entrepreneurship as well.
Just to add to that, I think because we're a tiny island, like, you have to think globally from day one, which is why we're so export driven as a nation. And also, like, there's people of Irish descent everywhere. There's not one founder whose eyes don't light up when they hear an Irish surname in a sales meeting they're about to go into, you know, so it's that Irish advantage is really real.
I know we're coming up on time towards the end. So one of the things, just before we wrap up, I'd love to know everyone's, you know, the bullishness on, there's lots of reasons to be bullish. There's probably a whole bunch of other reasons to think the world might explode at any point in time, but it'd be great to get everyone's prediction on, you know, what does the next what's your biggest prediction for the next 4 years in Ireland and in the Irish startup ecosystem? It'd be great. Claire, I'll pick on you first.
Well, obviously I'm in live stream shopping, and that's taking off and exploding in a major way, coming west from, as it has in China with SARS, and being in the middle of that's really exciting. But my other prediction is around sustainability. I think that's going to be a huge factor in how businesses are built. And that's like, if you look at MasterCard, they've announced recently that it's bonusing its executive based on delivering their ESG goals. And it's an excellent way to put like Earth on the agenda. Really important for B2B companies who have customers that are big global enterprises. So I think that sustainability will be a big theme.
I just echo that. I'd actually, obviously, I think it's the kind of ESG component, and obviously we're quite focused on impact, the whole area of impact. So impact can be more broader than just kind of sustainability, obviously, in terms of kind of the impact that businesses make. And I think the biggest transformation that's happened, I think, is the role of capital, the kind of notion of, well, what is capital about? What is conscious capital? What is impact? How do you track impact? And I think that's a trend that's going to feed into every investment thesis, public, private, alternatives, you name it. And I think it's definitely going to be a trend. In terms of our Irish companies and kind of, if you like, the outlook sectorally, I'm really encouraged by what I'm seeing in the health space coming out of Ireland. I think, and also the traction that those companies are having in the US as well, in large markets. So I think if I was to call out a sector, I think health and maybe health and well-being, the broader space is really exciting, and we're seeing lots of great things out of Ireland.
I totally agree with what both of the other panelists have said. I mean, by way of predictions, I was looking at this earlier this week. We IPO'd a business in London a couple of days ago, or a while back, called Trustpilot, which is a Danish company, and Denmark is a part of a market size of very much of sort of similar scale to the Irish market. And Trustpilot was Denmark's 8th unicorn, technology unicorn, over the last kind of 8-9 year period. The equivalent in our market, I think, is 2 over a sort of a similar time frame in the tech sector. And so, my prediction, and as I go through the kind of businesses that we're talking to in Ireland right now, the businesses that are raising Series A's, Series B's, and onwards, my prediction is that we will have 6 to 8 more companies that we will look back on in 4 years time, having kind of, I hasten to overuse the word unicorn because it is just but a label and but a number. But the point being, businesses that have sort of reached that threshold of really meaningful global scale. They've raised the capital, they've got the customer base and the growth trajectory to sort of really take them there, and to stay independent and to continue to build long-term sustainable businesses. And so, in 4 years' time, we can be sitting here talking about another big swathe of those companies that we've hopefully seen and hopefully backed over the next couple of years. And within that, to touch on a point that Claire raised, which we didn't really get into that much, more female representation at leadership level in these companies. So, funnily enough, in Ireland, we actually benchmark really well by way of sort of senior female decision makers within the venture capital industry. It's certainly not half, but on a we benchmark reasonably well. But I think more capital, more people coming into the market, more female founders starting companies, and I think we've started to see that. It takes a while for these things to sort of come through the system, and across the board, this needs to be addressed at the capital level and at the sort of grassroots, starting companies level. And I'm definitely seeing it. I think some good work has been done at the capital level. Definitely seeing and having a lot more conversations with sort of female-led businesses at an early stage. And so, to me, it's inevitable that these businesses will now go on to sort of raise capital. So when we're in 4 years' time talking about the number of global scale companies that we've seen come out of Ireland, I would place my bets that there will be a couple of female-led companies within that mix.
No, absolutely. It's one of the things. It was brought up to me by a US investor. Between 2009 2019, the only unicorn to come out of like tech in Ireland outside of healthcare was Intercom. He was like, that's pretty scary if you're like waiting 10 years for one. Yeah. And I think, to your point, Nicola, like, I could list 6 to 8 companies right now who've all raised money in the last 12 months who you could see being on that trajectory.
Yeah.
So it is, yeah, it's a step change.
There's two officially now with WorkHuman, right?
Yeah, oh yeah, we've got two officially two, and
so now we're at two. Indeed, a pipeline of many more.
Yeah, I'll just we're up on time now. So first of all, I just want to thank all the panelists for, I thought it was really interesting conversation, and to kind of round things out, you know, like you said, there is no silver bullet. It's a combination of encouraging local fund, new local fund managers as seen as a local business, changing the incentive structure to bring new capital into the market through high net worth, so that by tax efficiencies, and then just leveraging what the advantages we already have around talent to take the global creative talent that has been centralized in Ireland by all of this FDI, and then turning it into our own Indigenous industry. So thanks very much, everyone. It was a really great conversation, and thanks everyone for tuning in as well and listening to the business show. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Finn. Thanks, everybody.